two enemies, one shared cage within the mind. Where do you end, and the one you swore to loathe begin? Silence no longer belongs to you. We begin the story. The rain against the high arched windows of the library did not tap, it battered. It was a relentless, drowning sound, a rhythmic assault that mirrored the persistent thrum of anxiety beneath Hermione Granger's skin. The war had ended 6 months ago. The debris had been swept away, and the stones of Hogwarts had been mended with powerful reparo charms. Yet the castle felt different. It was a place of ghosts now, not all of them dead. Hermione sat at a secluded table in the restricted section, the smell of dust and decaying parchment filling her lungs. She wasn't really reading the text on advanced arithmancy in front of her. She was hiding. 8th year was a mistake. She knew it the moment she stepped off the train and saw the way the younger students looked at her, with awe that felt heavy, like a wet wool cloak. She was a heroine, a statue in the making, and she was exhausted. A shadow fell across her page. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. The scent of expensive cold rain and peppermint gave him away before his silhouette did. Draco Malfoy. He didn't speak. He simply moved to the shelf directly behind her, his movements fluid but stiff, like a man walking on a fractured leg who refuses to limp. He was a pariah, a ghost haunting the very halls his family had tried to destroy. Most students spat at his feet or hexed him when the teachers weren't looking. Hermione did neither. She simply pretended he didn't exist. It was a mutual agreement of silence, a cold war fought with averted gazes. But today, the air between them felt brittle, ready to snap. "You're blocking the light, Malfoy," she said, her voice scratching the silence. She didn't look up. "And you are breathing too loudly, Granger," came the drawled reply. His voice was lower than she remembered, stripped of its old, shrill arrogance, leaving only a jagged, tired edge. "But we all have our crosses to bear." Hermione finally snapped her book shut and turned. He looked terrible, pale, even for him, with dark bruises of exhaustion etched beneath eyes that were the color of a winter sky, grey and unforgiving. He was holding a stack of books with white-knuckled tension. "If you have a problem with my presence, the library is vast," she said, her tone clipped. "Go haunt another aisle." Draco's lip curled, not into a sneer, but into something weary. "McGonagall assigned me to inventory this section. Believe me, I have no desire to be anywhere near you. Your self-righteousness takes up too much room." "My self-righteousness?" Hermione stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the stone floor. The sound echoed like a gunshot. "I am just trying to study. You are the one lurking." "I don't lurk," he spat, stepping closer, his restraint slipping. "I endure, just like I endure looking at you and being reminded of everything I'm trying to forget." The words hung there, heavy and poisonous. It was the most honest thing he had said to her in years. "You think you're the only one trying to forget." Hermione's voice trembled with sudden hot anger. "We all have scars, Malfoy. Some of us just don't hide behind a mask of indifference." "It's not a mask if there's nothing left behind it," he murmured, almost to himself. Then his eyes hardened. "Move. I need that shelf." He reached past her, his arm brushing against her shoulder. The contact was electric, repulsive and shocking. Hermione flinched as if burned, and her hand jerked out, knocking the stack of books from his grasp. They tumbled to the floor with a chaotic clatter, But one object hidden between the volumes didn't sound like a book. It was a small octagonal box made of obsidian, which cracked open upon impact. Silence rushed back into the space, absolute and terrifying. From the broken box, a silver mist began to bleed out. It wasn't smoke. It was too heavy, swirling with a pearlescent, hypnotic glow. It looked like a pensive memory that had escaped its basin. "Don't touch it," Draco ordered, his voice sharp with panic. He dropped to his knees, reaching for the box to close it. "I know what not to touch," Hermione argued, instinctively kneeling opposite him. "It's a containment vessel. You broke the seal. You knocked it out of my hand. Because you crowded me." They were inches apart now, kneeling in the dust, the silver mist pooling between them, rising like a tide. It was beautiful and terrifying. In the center of the mist lay a jagged piece of glass, a shard of a mirror, the speculum mentis. Hermione recognized it from her reading, an ancient, dark artifact used by inquisitors to forcefully extract truth, to bridge minds. It was illegal. It was dangerous. "Draco, stop!" she gasped as he reached for the shard. "It needs to be covered," he hissed. Their hands collided. It wasn't a spark. It wasn't a shock. It was a collision of worlds. The moment their skin touched the glass and each other simultaneously, the library vanished. The sound of the rain vanished. For a singular, agonizing second, Hermione felt a coldness so profound it burned. She felt a crushing weight on her chest, a suffocating guilt that tasted like ash and bile. She felt a desire to scream that had been swallowed down for years. It wasn't her feeling. It was foreign, sharp and male. And Draco gasped, his eyes going wide, the pupils blown black. He felt a fire, a frantic, buzzing anxiety that felt like bees under the skin. He felt the phantom pain of a knife carving letters into flesh, a burning sting on his forearm that wasn't his dark mark. The sensation was violent, a psychic shriek that tore through them both. Then the glass shattered into dust. The mist evaporated instantly. Hermione fell back onto her heels, gasping for air, clutching her chest. Draco scrambled backward until his back hit the bookshelf, his breathing ragged. The library returned. The rain continued its assault. "What did you do?" Draco whispered, his voice shaking. He looked at his hand, then at her, horror dawning on his face. Hermione couldn't speak. Her heart was racing, but for a moment she wasn't sure if it was her heartbeat she was feeling, or the echo of his. She squeezed her eyes shut, forcing her mental walls up. Occlumency. Organize, categorize, shut it out. "It was the mirror," she managed to say, her voice sounding thin. We touched it at the same time." Draco stood up, his movements uncoordinated. He looked sick. "I have to go." "Malfoy, wait! We need to check if—" "I said, I have to go." He didn't look at her. He couldn't. He turned and fled the library, leaving the books scattered on the floor. Hermione sat alone in the dim light. She looked at her trembling hands. She felt singular again. The invasion was gone. It must have been a momentary discharge of magical energy. A fluke. Just a shock. She gathered her things with shaking hands, stacking the fallen books. She tried to rationalize the terror gripping her stomach. It was just an accident. It was over. The dormitory was quiet. The fire in the common room had died down to embers, casting long, dancing shadows against the crimson hangings. Hermione lay in her four-poster bed, the curtains drawn tight. She had tried to study, but the words swam before her eyes. She had tried to drink tea, but it tasted like ash. She told herself she was fine. She was Hermione Granger. She had survived a war. She had survived torture. She could survive a spark of dark magic in the library. Sleep eventually claimed her, dragging her down into a restless, murky darkness. But she didn't dream of the war. She didn't dream of Bellatrix or the snake. She dreamed she was standing in a room she didn't recognize. It was grand, cold, and smelled of lilies and decay. Malfoy Manor. She knew it instantly, though she was viewing it from a perspective that felt wrong. She was taller, and the floor felt different under her feet. She was standing before a tall black mirror, but the reflection wasn't hers. It was Draco. He was staring at himself, but his expression was one of utter repulsion. He raised a hand, her hand, no, his hand, and touched the glass. "You are a coward," the thought echoed, loud and clear, resonating in her skull like a spoken word. "You let them die. You are rotting from the inside out." The reflection in the mirror changed. It wasn't Draco anymore. It was Dumbledore falling from the tower. It was Katie Bell screaming. It was the face of the man he had been forced to torture. A wave of nausea crashed over her. No, over him. It was visceral. The self-loathing was a physical weight, a sludge filling his veins. He wanted to tear his own skin off just to escape the stain of the mark. "Quiet," he begged the reflection. "Please, just be quiet." Hermione woke up with a gasp, sitting bolt upright in her bed. Her sheets were tangled around her legs, damp with sweat. Her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "It was just a nightmare," she whispered to the empty room. "Just a nightmare." But as she sat there in the darkness of Gryffindor Tower, clutching her chest, she felt a sudden, sharp spike of emotion that did not belong to her. It was confusion, cold, sharp, icy confusion. And then a sensation. It was the feeling of silk sheets against skin, the smell of peppermint and rain, the feeling of a hand raking through hair in frustration. Hermione froze. Across the castle, deep in the dungeons, in a room buried under the Black Lake, Draco Malfoy was sitting up in his bed. He was staring at the wall, his chest heaving. He had just dreamed of being tortured on the floor of Malfoy Manor. But he hadn't been watching it. He had been feeling it. He had felt the blade carving mudblood into his arm. He had felt the searing, white-hot agony of the Cruciatus curse, but mixed with a defiant, burning rage that was alien to him. He had felt a fear that was not for himself, but for Harry and Ron. He blinked, trying to clear the vision, and then he felt it. The rough texture of wool blankets, the smell of wood smoke and old parchment, the pounding of a heart that was miles away from his own chest. Draco slowly raised a hand to his temple. Granger, he thought, the name forming in his mind not as a word, but as a question of pure disbelief. In Gryffindor Tower, Hermione flinched. She heard it, not with her ears, but in the centre of her mind. A whisper in the dark, a ghostly fingerprint on her brain. She squeezed her eyes shut, horrified tears prickling at the corners. The mirror hadn't just shocked them. It hadn't just bridged them for a second. It had left a door open. She could feel his fear now. It was a cold, slippery thing, coiling around her own panic. And she knew, with a terrifying certainty, that he could feel hers. The enemy wasn't just across the hall anymore. The enemy was in her head. The great hall was a symphony of clashing cutlery and morning chatter, but to Hermione it sounded like a distorted roar. She sat at the Gryffindor table, her fingers white-knuckled around a goblet of pumpkin juice she hadn't touched. The toast on her plate was cold and charred. Beside her, Ginny was recounting a Quidditch maneuver, but the words were muffled, as if Hermione were submerged in deep, icy water. Then it hit her. A sharp, sudden spike of irritation, followed by a wave of crushing boredom. It wasn't hers. It felt like a needle pricking the back of her mind, metallic and cold. "Stop tapping the damn spoon, Theo," a voice drawled inside her skull. Hermione gasped, nearly dropping her goblet. Her head whipped around toward the Slytherin table. Across the vast expanse of the hall, Draco Malfoy was sitting rigidly, his eyes fixed on his plate. His pale face was a mask of aristocratic indifference, but his hand was trembling almost imperceptibly as he gripped his fork. He felt her look at him. She knew he did, because the irritation in her head flared into a searing flash of alarm. "Get out!" the thought echoed. It wasn't a spoken word. It was a mental shove, a violent assertion of privacy that made her temples throb. Hermione shoved her plate away and scrambled to her feet, ignoring Ginny's concerned. "Hermione, are you all right?" She practically ran from the hall, her robes billowing behind her. She needed air. She needed silence. But how do you find silence when the noise is coming from inside your own bones? She reached a deserted corridor on the 3rd floor and leaned against the stone wall, pressing her forehead into the cool masonry. She tried to use her occlumency, the techniques she had practiced during the war to keep her mind from splintering. She imagined a great library with thousands of drawers, and she tried to shove the sensation of Draco into a box and lock it. But the box wouldn't stay shut. A moment later, the sound of hurried, heavy footsteps approached. She didn't have to look. She felt his proximity like a change in atmospheric pressure. The air turned thin and sharp. "What did you do to me, Granger?" Draco was there, standing a few feet away, his chest heaving as if he had run a marathon. His silver blonde hair was disheveled, and his eyes were wild, darting around as if searching for a physical, invisible cord connecting them. "I didn't do anything," she hissed, her voice low and frantic. "It was the artifact. You were the one holding it. And you were the one who knocked it over. You've infected me with your incessant, buzzing thoughts." He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her, dark and imposing. "I can feel your pulse. It's like a drum in my ears. I can taste that disgusting juice you were drinking. Make it stop. You think I want this?" Hermione stepped away from the wall, her eyes flashing with a mix of fear and indignation. "I can feel your self-loathing, Malfoy. It's like breathing in soot. It's suffocating. I can feel how much you hate being here, how much you hate yourself." "Shut up!" he roared, slamming his hand against the wall beside her head. The physical proximity sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated terror through the bond. But it wasn't just her terror. It was his, too. The terror of a boy who had been pushed into a corner by a Dark Lord. The terror of someone who knew that any mistake could mean death. For a second, their fears fused into a single, agonizing scream in their minds. They both winced, clutching their heads simultaneously. The intensity of the shared emotion was too much. It was like a feedback loop in a sound system, screeching louder and louder until it threatened to break them. "Don't," Hermione whispered, her voice breaking. "Don't get angry. It only makes it stronger." Draco pulled his hand back as if the wall were hot. He took several deep breaths, his eyes closed. Hermione watched him, her own heart slowing in synchronization with his. It was a terrifying intimacy, to be forced into the rhythm of your enemy's life. "We have to go to the restricted section tonight," she said, her voice steadier now, though her hands still shook. "We need to find out exactly what the Speculum Mentis does and how to break it. If we go to McGonagall, the Ministry will get involved. They'll seize the artifact and we'll be tied up in investigations for months. I can't have you in my head for months, Malfoy." "A rare moment of wisdom, Granger," he muttered, though the bite was gone from his tone. He looked exhausted, the skin beneath his eyes almost translucent. "Midnight. If I have to feel one more of your save-the-world epiphanies, I'll jump from the astronomy tower." He turned on his heel and strode away. As he disappeared around the corner, Hermione felt a sudden, sharp pang of loneliness. Not her own, but a residual echo of his. He was so incredibly alone. The castle at night was a place of deep shadows and whispering portraits. Hermione made her way to the library under her own disillusionment charm, her heart thumping a steady rhythm that she knew Draco could feel. She found him already there, sitting in the same spot where it had happened. He had a single candle lit, the flame flickering in the drafty room. He was surrounded by heavy, leather-bound tomes, his face illuminated by the amber glow. In the candlelight, the sharp angles of his face seemed softened, less like a predator and more like a weary survivor. "I've found something," he said without looking up as she approached. Hermione sat across from him. The table was small and their knees almost brushed. The proximity caused a hum of static in her mind, a tension that wasn't entirely unpleasant, which frightened her even more. "It's called a soul tether," Draco explained, his finger tracing a line of ancient runes. "The Speculum Mentis was designed to break the defenses of spies. If two people touch a cracked shard while their emotions are heightened, anger, fear, desperation, the magic misfires. Instead of one person reading the other, the two minds are fused at the emotional level." "Fused?" Hermione's throat went dry. "We aren't reading thoughts, not exactly," he said, finally looking at her. The grey of his eyes was stormy. "We are experiencing the residue. The stronger the emotion, the clearer the connection. If you feel joy, I'll feel a ghost of it. If you feel pain—" "I felt your nightmare," she whispered. Draco's expression shuttered. He looked back down at the book, his jaw tight. "And I felt yours. That cellar. The floor." The mention of the drawing room at Malfoy Manor sent a cold shiver down Hermione's spine. Instantly, she felt Draco's hand jerk on the table. He felt her chill. He reached out, his hand hovering over hers for a fraction of a second before he pulled it back, as if afraid of the contact. "Is there a cure?" she asked, her voice trembling. "There is a ritual and a potion," Draco said, his voice low. "But it's complex. It requires ingredients that are restricted, even for 8th years. And it requires us to harmonize." "Harmonize?" "We have to lower our guards completely. No occlumency, no secrets. The tether only breaks when there is no resistance left to snap against." Hermione looked at him, the boy who had spent years sneering at her, the man who had stood by while she was tortured. The idea of lowering her guards to him felt like inviting a wolf into her heart. "I don't know if I can do that," she admitted. "You think I want you seeing what's inside me?" Draco snapped, his eyes flashing with a sudden defensive heat. "I am a Malfoy. My mind is the only thing I have left that isn't forfeit to the Ministry or the public. Do you think I enjoy having a Gryffindor golden girl poking around in my sins?" The seesaw swung violently. The warmth of their shared intellectual pursuit was extinguished by the cold blast of their history. Hermione felt his bitterness, his pride, and his overwhelming sense of being a failure. It was a heavy, dark cloak that settled over her shoulders. "Fine," she said, her voice icy. "Then we suffer. But I will start brewing the base of the potion in the old potions classroom. Don't come unless you're ready to actually cooperate." She stood to leave, but as she turned, her sleeve caught on a stack of books, pulling them toward the edge. Draco's hand shot out, catching the books, and her wrist at the same time. The contact was no longer a shock. It was a flood. For a heartbeat, the library disappeared. Hermione saw a memory. Draco, 16 years old, crying in front of a broken cabinet. She felt his bone-deep exhaustion, the way his soul felt like it was fraying at the edges. But beneath that, she felt something else, a sudden, sharp spark of realization. He was looking at her, and for the first time, he wasn't seeing a mudblood or a rival. He was seeing a person who was just as broken as he was. His grip on her wrist lingered. His thumb brushed against her pulse point, and she felt his heart skip a beat. Or was it hers? The silence between them was no longer empty. It was thick with things they couldn't say. Draco let go of her wrist as if he had been burned. "Midnight tomorrow, Granger," he muttered, his voice thick. "I'll bring the powdered bicorn horn." Hermione nodded, unable to find her voice. She hurried out of the library, the ghost of his touch still searing her skin. As she walked through the darkened corridors, she realized with a jolt of terror that she wasn't just thinking about the cure anymore. She was thinking about him. And she knew, with a sinking feeling in her gut, that he was thinking about her too. The door was open, and the cold air of his world was beginning to fill her own. The old potions classroom in the dungeons was a place where time seemed to have curdled. It was far removed from the refurbished halls above, smelling of damp stone, stagnant water, and the sharp metallic tang of copper. Shadows gathered in the corners like sentient things, swaying in the rhythmic pulse of the blue flames beneath Hermione's cauldron. She stirred the mixture, a base of fluxweed and crushed lacewing flies, with a steady hand, but her mind was anything but calm. Since the library, the echoes had become more frequent. It was no longer just the heavy spikes of emotion. It was the mundane drift of his existence. She knew when he was waking up, because a sudden, sharp clarity would pierce her morning fog. She knew when he was hungry, because a hollow ache would bloom in her stomach, even after she had eaten. And she knew the moment he entered the dungeons. The heavy oak door creaked open, admitting a draught that made the candles flicker and hiss. Draco stepped inside, the silver embroidery of his Slytherin robes catching the light of the cauldron. He looked wary, his shoulders hunched as if bracing for an attack. "You're late," Hermione said, her voice echoing in the hollow space. "I had to wait for Filch to pass the Slytherin common room," Draco replied. He walked toward her, his footsteps measured. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet pouch. "The bicorn horn. stolen from Slughorn's private store. I hope your conscience can handle the theft, Granger." He held it out, but as she reached to take it, their fingers didn't just touch. They brushed, and the world tilted. Suddenly, Hermione wasn't in the damp classroom. She was standing in the middle of the great hall, surrounded by a crowd of faceless students who were all pointing and whispering. The shame was a physical weight, a leaden pressure in her chest. Look at the coward. Look at the Death Eater. Then the scene shifted. She was looking at her own reflection in a mirror, but the face looking back was Draco's, and he was raising a wand to his own temple, his eyes bright with tears. She gasped, pulling her hand back, the pouch falling onto the stone floor with a soft thud. The vision snapped. Draco was staring at her, his face ashen, his breath coming in short, jagged bursts. He looked exposed, like a man whose skin had been peeled away. "Stay out of there," he hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and humiliation. "I didn't give you permission to see that." "I didn't choose to see it," Hermione cried, her own heart racing in sympathy with his. "Do you think I want to feel your self-loathing? It's miserable, Draco. It's like drowning in black ink." "Then stop looking." "I can't stop looking when you're shouting it at me with every breath you take." She stepped closer, her intelligence warring with her burgeoning empathy. "You're holding it all in so tightly that it's leaking out of the cracks. If you would just stop fighting the bond for 1 second, maybe the pressure would drop." Draco let out a harsh, dry laugh. "Stop fighting? If I stop fighting, there's nothing left. Just a hollow shell of a Malfoy with a charred arm and a ruined name." He reached down to retrieve the pouch, his movements stiff. When he stood up, he didn't move away. He stayed within her orbit, the heat from the cauldron pushing them together. The atmosphere in the room changed, turning heavy and electric. The seesaw tipped from the coldness of their argument into a strange, breathless tension. In the silence, the only sound was the bubbling of the potion and the distant drip of water from the ceiling. Hermione looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the way his eyelashes cast long shadows over his cheekbones, the way his bottom lip was bitten raw. Without thinking, she reached out. Her hand hovered near his face, a silent question. She saw his pupils dilate, felt the sudden, sharp spike of want that radiated from him, a hunger for touch so intense it made her dizzy. But just as quickly, it was replaced by a wall of ice. He flinched away. "Don't," he whispered. "Don't pity me." "It's not pity," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Then what is it? Morbid curiosity? A research project for the brightest witch of her age?" He turned his back to her, leaning his hands on the edge of a nearby workbench. "Go back to your brewing, Granger. Let's just get this over with." The rejection stung. It was a cold splash of water that brought her back to reality. She was a Gryffindor. He was a Slytherin. She was a hero. He was a villain on parole. The lines were drawn in blood and history. She turned back to the cauldron, her movements mechanical as she added the powdered horn. The potion turned a deep, bruised purple. For the next hour, they worked in a silence that was louder than any shouting match. It was a dance of non-verbal cues. He would move to the left, and she would intuitively shift to the right to make room. He handed her a silver dagger when she needed to juice the shrivel fig. She pushed the mortar and pestle toward him just as he reached for it. Their minds were starting to sync in a way that had nothing to do with the artifact and everything to do with the rhythm of the work. Hermione felt a strange sense of peace settling over her, a warmth that wasn't hers, but was being reflected back from him. He was finding solace in the precision of the alchemy, and in turn, she was finding solace in him. She caught him watching her as she stirred. His gaze was intense, focused on the way a stray curl of her hair had escaped her braid and was dampened by the steam. She felt his thought, a flickering golden image of him reaching out to tuck that curl behind her ear. Her hand faltered. The ladle hit the side of the cauldron with a soft clink. "Draco," she breathed. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers. For a moment, the masks were gone. There was no Malfoy and no Granger. There were only two tired souls tethered together in the dark. "I can't do this for much longer," he admitted, his voice low and cracked. "Every time I see you in the halls, I feel your sadness. When you laugh with Weasley, I feel a jealousy so sharp it feels like a physical wound, even though I have no right to it. It's making me insane." "Jealousy?" Hermione asked, her heart leaping. Draco's face hardened, the shame returning. "Because he gets to be near you without a curse forcing him there. Because he can look at you and not see a ghost." He stepped toward her again, and this time, when she didn't move away, he reached out. His fingers brushed the stray curl, his touch so light it was almost a suggestion. But through the bond, it felt like a tidal wave. Hermione's breath hitched. She felt his fear, the fear that he was overstepping, that she would scream, that he was irredeemable. But beneath that, she felt a desperate, fragile hope. She leaned into his touch, just a fraction of an inch. The reaction was instantaneous. Draco's hand dropped to her jaw, his thumb tracing the line of her lip. His eyes were searching hers, looking for the hatred he expected to find, but finding only a reflected vulnerability. "You're so loud, Hermione," he whispered, using her name for the first time. It sounded like a prayer. "Your head is full of so much light. It hurts." "Then let it in," she murmured. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. They stood there for a long time, eyes closed, simply breathing each other's air. The bond was humming, a steady, golden vibration that drowned out the cold of the dungeons. For the first time since the war ended, Hermione felt like she was standing on solid ground. But then, the door to the classroom rattled. The sound was like a thunderclap. Draco jerked away, his face instantly reverting to a mask of cold arrogance. Hermione scrambled back, her heart plunging into her stomach. "Is someone in there?" A voice called from the corridor. It was Filch. "Nox," Draco hissed, dousing the candles and the fire beneath the cauldron with a wave of his wand. In the sudden, absolute darkness, Hermione felt his hand find hers. He squeezed it once, a hard, desperate pressure before letting go. "Go," he whispered into her ear, his breath hot against her skin. "Through the back storage room. I'll distract him." "But go!" She fled into the shadows, her heart breaking at the sudden coldness where his hand had been. As she slipped through the narrow door into the ingredients closet, she felt a wave of pure, icy disdain wash over her through the bond. It was Draco, greeting Filch with his usual venomous sneer. He was playing his part. He was pushing the world away to keep her safe from the scandal of being found with him. But as she leaned against the shelves of pickled toads, Hermione felt the truth beneath his act. She felt his heart racing. She felt the lingering warmth of her skin on his fingertips. The seesaw had swung again, from warmth to a cold, necessary distance. But as she made her way back to the Gryffindor Tower, Hermione knew that the silence of the night was a lie. The enemy in her head was no longer an intruder. He was becoming the only thing she wanted to hear. The rain that had plagued the castle for weeks finally broke, leaving behind a cold, biting mist that clung to the great lake like a shroud. Inside Hogwarts, the atmosphere was no less suffocating. It was the anniversary of the Battle of Hogwarts, a day the Ministry had insisted on celebrating as a day of remembrance. But for those who had lived through it, it was simply the day the world had cracked. Hermione found herself standing on the edge of the astronomy tower, her fingers curled tightly around the cold stone railing. She wasn't supposed to be here. This was the place where Dumbledore had fallen, the place where Draco's soul had arguably begun its long, slow fracture. But she was drawn to it, pulled by a magnetic, agonizing grief that wasn't entirely her own. Through the bond, she could feel him. Draco was somewhere deep in the castle, perhaps in the dungeons or a forgotten classroom, but his internal state was bleeding into hers with terrifying clarity. It was a grey, ash-heavy despair. It felt like walking through a house where every room was filled with the ghosts of people you had failed. Suddenly, a sharp, white-hot flash of panic pierced her mind. It was so intense that Hermione's knees buckled. No, not again. Please. She saw a flash of silver hair, a dark corridor, and a group of seventh-year boys, Gryffindors and Hufflepuffs, cornering a lone figure. She felt the impact of a stinging hex against a cheek, the taste of blood in a mouth that wasn't hers. Malfoy, she gasped, her voice lost to the wind. She didn't think. She ran. She followed the thread of his pain down the spiral stairs, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The bond acted as a compass, leading her toward the North Gallery. As she rounded the corner, she saw them. 3 boys stood over a slumped figure in black robes. "Thought you could just come back and act like nothing happened, did you, Death Eater?" One of the boys spat, his wand leveled at Draco's throat. Draco didn't fight back. He sat against the wall, his lip bleeding, his eyes vacant. He wasn't even reaching for his wand. Through the tether, Hermione felt his utter surrender. He believed they were right. He believed he deserved the blows. "Stop it!" Hermione's voice rang out, sharp and authoritative. The boys jumped, turning to see the war heroine standing there, her wand drawn and her eyes flashing with a terrifying light. "Granger, he is a student at this school, and you are 3 against 1, she hissed, stepping forward. 10 points from each of your houses and a week's detention with Filch. If I see you near him again, I'll ensure Professor McGonagall hears about your heroic conduct." The boys muttered under their breaths, casting one last hateful glance at Draco before scurrying away. The silence that followed was heavy. Hermione dropped to her knees beside him, her breathing ragged. "Draco! Draco! Look at me!" He didn't move. He was shivering, a fine, rhythmic tremor that she could feel in her own limbs. The mental walls he usually kept so high had crumbled under the weight of the day's memories. She felt his mind spiraling, back to the night on the tower, back to the fire in the room of requirement, back to the screams of the people he couldn't save. "It's too much," he whispered, his voice a ghost of itself. "Make it stop, Hermione. Please." She reached out, her hands trembling, and cupped his face. The contact was like a lightning strike. She didn't just feel his pain, she saw it. She saw the night Voldemort moved into his home. She saw the way his mother's face had aged 10 years in a single week. She saw the moment he realized he was a monster, and the moment he realized he didn't want to be. "Focus on me," she commanded, her voice thick with emotion. "Draco, look at my eyes, right here. Stay with me." She began to use her occlumency, not to shut him out, but to project her own strength into him. She visualized a bright, warm light, the golden glow of the Gryffindor common room fire, the feeling of Ron's hand on her shoulder, the smell of summer rain. She pushed these images through the bond, trying to drown out the black sludge of his guilt. Slowly, his breathing began to steady. His eyes, once glazed and distant, began to focus on hers. "Why?" he breathed, his hand coming up to cover hers, pinning it to his cheek. His skin was ice cold. "Why do you care? I watched you. I let her." "I know," she whispered, a tear escaping and trailing down her face. "I know what you did, and I know what you didn't do. I've been in your head, Draco. I know who you are when no one is watching." The vulnerability between them was absolute. In this drafty stone corridor, the enemy in my head became something else entirely. He wasn't the boy who had bullied her. He was the man who was dying of 1,000 internal cuts, and she was the only one who could see the wounds. He leaned forward, resting his forehead against her shoulder, his body finally sagging with exhaustion. Hermione wrapped her arms around him, pulling him close, shielding him from the cold and the ghosts of the castle. She felt his tears dampen her robes, and for the first time, the seesaw didn't swing. It settled into a deep, aching warmth. Trust. It was a terrifying thing to find in the middle of a war-torn life. "I can't be what you want," he muffled against her neck. "I'm broken, Hermione. There are pieces of me that are just gone." "Then we'll find new pieces," she replied, her hands stroking the back of his neck, her fingers tangling in his soft, fine hair. For a few minutes, they stayed like that, two survivors clinging to each other in the wreckage of their history. The bond was quiet now, a soft hum of mutual comfort. But as always, the world outside refused to stay silent. Footsteps echoed from the far end of the gallery. Draco stiffened, the old instincts of self-preservation snapping back into place. He pulled away from her, his face hardening into that familiar, polished mask. The warmth vanished so quickly, it made Hermione's head spin. "You should go," he said, his voice cold and flat. "If anyone sees you like this, your reputation will be ruined." "I don't care about my reputation, Draco." "Well, I do," he snapped, standing up and brushing the dust from his robes. The wall was back up, higher and thicker than before. He looked down at her with an expression that bordered on contempt. "Thank you for the charity, Granger. Truly. It's exactly what I expect from a Gryffindor." The whiplash was staggering. Hermione stood up, her face flushing with hurt and confusion. Through the bond, she felt a jagged, defensive pride. He was pushing her away because he was terrified of how much he needed her. He was retreating into the enemy because the lover was a person he didn't think he had the right to be. "You're a coward, Draco Malfoy," she said, her voice low and steady. Not because you couldn't kill Dumbledore, but because you're too afraid to let someone see you're human." He flinched, as if she had slapped him. For a split second, the mask slipped, revealing a raw, bleeding wound of a man. Then, it was gone. "Midnight at the potions room," he said, ignoring her words. "The potion needs the final stir." He turned and walked away, his stride elegant and purposeful, leaving Hermione alone in the gallery. She stood there, her heart aching with a betrayal that was entirely her own. She had given him a piece of her light, and he had thrown it back in her face. But as she watched him disappear, she felt a lingering sensation in the back of her mind, a faint, ghostly echo of his voice that didn't match his cold words. "I'm sorry," it whispered. "I'm so sorry." The seesaw had hit the ground with a thud, leaving them both on opposite sides of a widening chasm. Hermione knew that the next time they met, the tension wouldn't just be about the curse or the war. It would be about the fact that they had seen the truth, and neither of them knew how to live with it. She walked back toward Gryffindor Tower, the silence in her head louder than any scream. The anniversary was almost over, but the war inside her mind was only just beginning. The days following the anniversary were a blur of grey skies and suffocating silence. The seesaw had swung into a brutal, icy winter. In the corridors, when their paths crossed, Draco didn't even look at her. He became a master of the hollow gaze, staring through Hermione as if she were made of glass. Through the bond, he had retreated into a fortress of occlumency, so dense it felt like a physical wall of stone in her mind. It was a betrayal of the vulnerability they had shared in the North Gallery, and it stung more than his old insults ever had. Hermione threw herself into her studies with a ferocity that bordered on madness. She spent hours in the library, the scratch of her quill the only sound in the vacuum of her thoughts. But even with his walls up, she could feel the edges of him, a dull, throbbing ache of loneliness that he couldn't quite extinguish. The tension reached its breaking point on a Tuesday evening during a joint Gryffindor-Slytherin advanced potions session. Slughorn was beaming, his belly shaking as he moved between the bubbling cauldrons. "Today, class, we look at the draft of living death once more," he announced. A delicate balance, a test of patience. Hermione was paired with Ernie Macmillan, but her focus was 3 tables over, where Draco was working alone. He was moving with a clinical, robotic precision. But then, Harry walked past him, his shoulder accidentally brushing Draco's. "Watch it, Malfoy," Harry muttered, his voice tense. He hadn't forgiven Draco, and the anniversary had only sharpened his resentment. Draco didn't snap back. He didn't even look up. But in Hermione's head, a dam burst. A sudden, violent surge of self-loathing and resentment flooded her senses. It was so sharp she gasped, dropping her silver stir rod into the cauldron with a splash. "They all think I'm a monster." The thought hissed in her skull, dark and acidic. Potter, the hero, Granger, the saint. I should just let the fumes take me. Hermione's heart hammered. She could feel his hands shaking through the link, even as they appeared steady to the rest of the class. She saw the way he gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white as bone. "Hermione, you okay?" Ernie asked, looking at her with concern. I need some air," she stammered, abandoning her station. She ignored Slughorn's confused call and hurried out of the dungeon classroom. She didn't go far. She waited in the shadows of the corridor, her chest heaving. 5 minutes later, The door creaked open. Draco emerged, his face a mask of sweating marble. He didn't see her at first. He leaned against the opposite wall, his eyes closed, his breathing ragged. "You can't keep doing this, Draco," she said softly, stepping into the dim torchlight. He jumped, his eyes snapping open. The coldness returned instantly, but it was brittle. "Doing what, Granger? Living? I'm sorry my existence is such a burden on your psychic health." "The walls," she said, ignoring his bite. "You're suffocating yourself trying to keep me out. I can feel the pressure. It's going to break you." "Better me than you," he spat, though the words lacked their usual venom. He started to walk past her, but she reached out and caught his sleeve. "Stop running! We were supposed to meet at midnight to finish the potion. Why didn't you come last night?" Draco turned on her, his eyes blazing with a desperate, trapped light. "Because I can't look at you. Every time I do, I remember that I cried on your shoulder like a pathetic child. I remember that you saw the worst parts of me and didn't turn away, and it makes me want to burn this whole castle down just to escape the look in your eyes." "What look?" she demanded, stepping into his space, her own anger flaring. "Hope!" he roared. "You look at me like there's something left to save, like I'm not a hollowed-out husk of a human being. I can't live up to that, Hermione. I'm a Malfoy. I'm a Death Eater. I'm a failure. Let me be those things in peace." "I won't." She was shouting now, her hands trembling with the force of her conviction. "I won't let you drown because you think you deserve to. I've been in your head, Draco. I've felt the parts of you that are kind, the parts that are terrified, the parts that just want to be loved." The word love hung in the damp air of the dungeon like a curse. Draco froze. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the distant bubbling of cauldrons from the classroom. The seesaw tipped violently. The anger vanished, replaced by a devastating raw vulnerability. He looked at her, his lips parted. Through the bond, Hermione felt a wave of longing so intense it made her knees weak. It was a hunger for connection, for forgiveness, for her. It was the warmth trying to fight through the cold, and it was winning. "You don't know what you're saying," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I know exactly what I'm saying," she replied, her voice dropping to a low, intense hum. "I know the difference between the enemy I was told to hate and the man who was standing in front of me." She reached out, her fingers grazing the back of his hand. This time, he didn't pull away. He turned his hand over, interlacing his fingers with hers. The contact was a revelation. Through the tether, the static cleared. The noise of the castle, the weight of the war, the expectations of the world. It all fell away. There was only the heat of his palm against hers and the frantic, beautiful synchronization of their hearts. For a moment, they were just two people, stripped of their names and their histories. "The potion," Draco muttered, though he didn't let go of her hand. "We need the powdered moonstone. It has to be added at the precise moment of the moon's zenith tonight." "I have it," she said, her voice breathy. "The room of requirement. Midnight. It's safer than the dungeons now." He nodded, his thumb tracing a slow, agonizing circle on the back of her hand. The non-verbal intimacy was overwhelming, a silent promise, a temporary truce in the war of their souls. "I'll be there," he promised. But as he let go and turned to walk back into the classroom, the cold returned. Not the cold of hatred, but the cold of fear. Hermione felt his doubt creeping back in like a fog. She'll realize. She'll see the truth eventually, and she'll leave. Everyone leaves. Hermione watched him go, her heart aching. The seesaw was in mid-air now, suspended between the hope of their connection and the crushing weight of their past. She knew that tonight was the turning point. Either the potion would work and they would be free of each other, or the bond would finally consume them. As she walked toward her next class, she realized she wasn't sure which outcome she feared more. The enemy in my head was becoming a part of her, and the thought of the silence that would follow the cure felt like a different kind of death. Midnight came with a silver moon that carved shadows into the stone floors of the 7th floor. Hermione stood before the blank stretch of wall opposite the tapestry of Barnabas the Barmy. I need a place to be alone with him. I need a place to find the truth. The door appeared, a heavy, dark wood with a silver handle. Inside, the room of requirement had provided a sanctuary. It was small and intimate, filled with the scent of dried lavender and old books. A soft fire crackled in a hearth, and a single table held a simmering cauldron. Draco was already there. He was standing by the fire, his back to her. In the flickering light, he looked small despite his height. "Is it ready?" she asked softly. He turned, and the look in his eyes made her breath catch. It wasn't the look of a rival or an enemy. It was the look of a man facing his execution or his salvation. "The moon is at its peak," he said. "It's time, Hermione." They moved to the cauldron together. The potion was a shimmering, iridescent silver, reflecting the moonlight that filtered through a high, enchanted window. This was the moment, the harmonization. To break the tether, they had to be completely honest. No masks, no shields. Hermione held the vial of powdered moonstone over the liquid. "Together?" "Together," he echoed. As the powder hit the surface, the potion hissed, and a thick, sweet-smelling vapor began to rise. "We have to speak it," Draco whispered, his eyes locked on hers. "The truth we've been hiding." Hermione felt the bond tighten, pulling at the very center of her being. She felt his secrets, the way he had watched her in the library for years, the way he had secretly admired her brilliance, even as he spat slurs at her. She felt his shame, yes, but she also felt his burgeoning, terrifying affection. "I don't want to hate you anymore," she confessed, the words torn from her. "I never hated you," he admitted, the truth finally breaking through his pride. "I hated that I couldn't be like you. I hated that you were everything I was told to despise, and yet you were the only thing that felt real." The vapor around them turned golden. The tension in the room was suffocating, a physical pressure that pushed them closer and closer. The seesaw was tilting toward the final shift. Draco reached out, his hands trembling as he took hers. "If we do this, if we drink the potion, the voice goes away. The feeling goes away. We go back to being nothing." "Is that what you want?" she asked, her heart breaking. He didn't answer with words. He leaned in, his face inches from hers. Through the bond, she felt his desire, a searing, white-hot flame that eclipsed everything else. "I need to know what's next," he whispered against her lips. And in that moment, the enemy vanished completely. The room of requirement had shrunk around them, the walls drawing closer until the world outside, the war, the houses, the blood, felt like a dream dreamt by someone else. The golden vapor of the potion swirled between them, a physical manifestation of the magic that had bridged their souls. Draco's hands were no longer cold. They were burning where they gripped hers, a desperate anchor in a sea of shifting emotions. "If we drink this," Draco repeated, his voice a ragged thread. "The noise stops. I won't feel your heart when you're frightened. I won't feel your light when I'm in the dark. I'll just be me again." The thought of it sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated terror through the bond. It wasn't just his fear, it was hers. The enemy in my head had become a companion, a witness to the parts of her that she never showed to Harry or Ron. To lose him was to go back to being the girl who carried the weight of the wizarding world on her shoulders alone. "Is that a threat or a promise, Draco?" Hermione whispered. Before he could answer, the potion began to react to the raw honesty in the air. The iridescent silver liquid began to bubble violently, turning a deep, bruised violet. This was the stage the book had warned about, the emotional purging. To sever a soul tether, the magic had to draw out the very memories that anchored the connection. Suddenly, the room vanished. Hermione wasn't in the room of requirement anymore. She was standing in the middle of a cold, cavernous hall, the Malfoy Manor drawing room. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and terror. She saw herself on the floor, small and broken, while Bellatrix loomed over her. The pain of the knife was a dull roar, but the real agony came from the side. She was seeing it through Draco's eyes. She felt the paralyzing weight of his cowardice. She felt the way his stomach turned as he watched her blood hit the floor. She felt the silent scream in his throat, a plea for it to stop, and the crushing, soul-deep shame of knowing he would do nothing to stop it because he was a Malfoy, and he was afraid. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry." The thought chanted in his mind like a funeral dirge. "Stop it!" Hermione cried out, her voice echoing in the memory. The scene shifted. Now she was Draco, standing on the astronomy tower. The wind was whipping his hair into his eyes. He looked at Dumbledore, the man who had offered him a way out, and he felt the cold iron of the dark mark on his arm. He felt the impossible choice: kill the only person who could save him, or watch his mother die. He felt the moment his childhood ended, not with a bang, but with the whimpering of a boy who realized he was a monster. Then the perspective flipped. Draco was now Hermione. He was in the forest, shivering in a tent, listening to the radio for names of the dead. He felt the hunger, the constant low-level hum of anxiety, and the terrifying responsibility of keeping Harry alive. But he also felt the warmth, the fierce, protective love she had for her friends, the way she would burn the world down to save them. He felt her brilliance, a mind that never stopped moving, always searching for a solution, even when there was no hope. And then he felt the moment she had looked at him in the library, not with hatred, but with a flicker of recognition. "She sees me," he thought, and the thought was so full of wonder it made his chest ache. The visions snapped. They were back in the room of requirement, both of them collapsed on the floor, gasping for air. The potion had boiled over, staining the stone floor purple. Draco was shaking, his face buried in his hands. "You saw," he choked out. "You saw how I just stood there. You felt how much of a coward I am." Hermione crawled toward him, her own limbs heavy with the residue of his grief. She reached out, pulling his hands away from his face. His eyes were red-rimmed, his expression shattered. I felt the cowardice. Yes, she said, her voice steady despite the tears. But I also felt the love. I felt how much it broke you to watch me suffer. I felt the boy who wanted to reach out but didn't know how. You aren't a monster, Draco. You're a survivor who has been punished for surviving. How can you say that? He spat, a flare of his old defensive anger returning. I'm the reason your arm is scarred. I'm the reason the war lasted as long as it did. No, she said firmly, her hands moving to his shoulders. The war is the reason. The choices made by men older and crueler than us are the reason. We were children, Draco. We were just children trying not to drown. The seesaw swung with a dizzying force. The cold of his guilt met the warmth of her forgiveness, and for a moment the temperature in the room seemed to skyrocket. Draco looked at her, truly looked at her, and the walls he had spent years building finally, irrevocably crumbled. He didn't see the mudblood or the Gryffindor know-it-all. He saw a woman who knew the darkest corners of his soul and was still holding his hands. I can't drink it, he whispered. The potion? I don't want the silence, he admitted, his voice cracking. I'm terrified of what happens when I can't feel you anymore. It's the only thing that makes this place bearable, the only thing that makes me bearable. Hermione felt her heart skip a beat. The non-verbal intimacy of the moment was so thick she could almost taste it. She could feel his pulse under her fingertips, a frantic, desperate rhythm. She could feel his desire, not just the physical pull, but a deep, spiritual craving for her presence. We have to, she said softly. The tether is unstable. If we don't sever the magic, it will eventually drain us both. The artifact was broken, Draco. It was never meant to be a permanent bridge. I know, he said, his gaze dropping to her lips. I know. He reached out, his hand trembling as he cupped her cheek. His thumb traced the line of her jaw, a touch so light and reverent it made Hermione's breath hitch. She leaned into him, her eyes closing. Through the bond, she felt a sudden, sharp spike of resolve. One last time, he murmured, before the silence. He leaned in, and this time there was no hesitation. His lips met hers in a kiss that was a collision of two worlds. It wasn't the polished, practiced kiss of a pure-blood heir. It was the desperate, starving kiss of a man who had been wandering in a desert for years and had finally found water. Hermione's hands moved to his hair, pulling him closer, her fingers tangling in the silver strands. The sensation was explosive. Through the tether, the kiss was magnified 1,000-fold. She felt his tongue against hers, but she also felt the pleasure he was feeling, the way her touch ignited a fire in his veins, the way her scent, vanilla and old books, filled his lungs. It was an intimacy so absolute it was terrifying. There were two minds, two bodies, and one soul, all caught in a single breathless moment. The seesaw had stopped. There was no approach and repulsion. There was only the surrender. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless, their eyes wide with the realization of what they had just done. The potion in the cauldron had turned a clear, shimmering white. It was finished. The ritual was ready. "We drink," Draco said, his voice stronger now, though his hand still lingered on her waist. "We drink," she agreed. They stood up and moved to the table. Hermione ladled the potion into two small crystal vials. She handed one to Draco. Her hand was steady, but her heart was breaking. They stood facing each other, the silence of the room heavy with the weight of the coming separation. "I'll see you on the other side, Hermione," Draco said. "I'll see you there, Draco." They raised the vials and drank. The effect was instantaneous. A cold, sharp wind seemed to blow through Hermione's mind, sweeping away the cobwebs and the echoes. The noise of his guilt, the smell of his peppermint, the rhythm of his heartbeat. It all vanished in a single, violent stroke. Hermione gasped, dropping the vial. It shattered on the floor. She looked at Draco. He was standing perfectly still, his eyes squeezed shut. He looked empty. She reached out with her mind, searching for that familiar, jagged presence. Silence. Absolute, terrifying silence. She was alone in her head for the first time in weeks, and for some reason, it felt like she had just been cast into the void. Draco opened his eyes. They were a clear, piercing grey, no longer clouded by the bond. He looked at her, and for a moment, Hermione feared the enemy had returned with the silence. "Is it gone?" she whispered. Draco didn't speak. He stepped forward, his eyes searching hers. The tension between them was no longer magical. It was entirely human. He reached out and touched her arm, the one with the scar. "I can't feel you," he said, his voice low. "I know. But I can still see you, Hermione." He didn't pull away. He didn't sneer. He didn't retreat into his pride. He stood there in the quiet of the room of requirement, a man who had lost a curse but had found something far more dangerous. He leaned down and kissed her again. And this time, it wasn't because a magical bridge forced them together. It was because he wanted to. And as Hermione kissed him back, she realized that the enemy in my head was gone, but the man in her heart was just beginning to speak. The silence was the loudest thing Hermione had ever heard. It was a vacuum, a hollow ache where a frantic, living rhythm had been for weeks. As she walked down the spiral staircase from the 7th floor, her own footsteps sounded heavy and alien. She reached out with her mind, an instinctive muscle memory twitch, searching for the cold spike of Draco's irritation or the low hum of his exhaustion. There was nothing. Just the dry, dusty air of the castle and the distant hoot of an owl from the owlery. She should have felt relieved. She was Hermione Granger again, whole, private, and unburdened. But as she lay in her bed in the Gryffindor dormitory, the crimson curtains felt like a cage. For the first time since the war ended, her thoughts were entirely her own, and they were terrifyingly focused on the boy she had left behind in the room of requirement. "I can still see you, Hermione." His voice hadn't been a thought in her head. It had been a vibration in the air. The realization was a slow-burning fire in her chest. The magical tether was gone, but the emotional wreckage it had left behind was far more permanent. The next morning, the great hall felt different. The seesaw of their relationship had been replaced by a strange magnetic stasis. Hermione sat with Harry and Ron, listening to them discuss the upcoming Quidditch match against Ravenclaw. She tried to participate, to be the person they expected her to be, but her eyes kept drifting toward the Slytherin table. Draco was there. He wasn't hiding behind his occlumency walls anymore. He looked raw, his skin pale against the dark green of his robes. He wasn't eating. He was staring at a point on the table, his fingers tracing the grain of the wood. Suddenly, he looked up. Their eyes met across the expanse of the hall. In the past, This look would have triggered a flood of shared sensation, the spike of his pulse, the flash of his defensive pride. Now, there was only the visual, the storm cloud grey of his irises and the slight tilt of his head. He didn't look away. He didn't sneer. He simply watched her, a silent question in his gaze. "Hermione, you're doing it again," Ron said, waving a fork in front of her face. "Doing what?" she asked, tearing her eyes away from Draco. "Staring into space. You've been off since that detention in the library. If Malfoy did something to you—" "He didn't do anything, Ron," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. We worked on a project. It's over now." But it wasn't over. It was the middle of the story, the moment where the conflict shifted from the external curse to the internal choice. Throughout the day, the tension between them became a physical thing. They met in the corridors between classes, and every time the air seemed to thicken. It was a slow burn, a gradual build-up of heat that made Hermione's skin itch. She found herself seeking him out, taking the long way to the Charms classroom just to pass the dungeons. She found him in the Transfiguration courtyard during the afternoon break. He was leaning against a stone pillar, watching the mist roll in from the lake. The courtyard was empty, the other students having sought the warmth of the common rooms. "The silence is annoying, isn't it?" Draco said as she approached. He didn't turn around. He knew it was her. Perhaps he had developed his own kind of Granger compass that didn't require magic. "It's lonely," she admitted, standing beside him. "I find myself waiting for you to tell me I'm being dramatic," he murmured, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Or to feel that frantic little buzz you get when you're about to solve a puzzle. The back of my head feels light. Too light. We got what we wanted, Draco. We're free." He finally turned to look at her. The seesaw tilted toward the cold for a moment, the cold of reality. "Are we? I don't feel free, Hermione. I feel like a man who was given sight for a month and then had his eyes put out. I know what's in there now. I know what I'm missing." He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming, even without the magical bond. The non-verbal intimacy of their proximity was agonizing. He smelled of the cold lake and that faint, persistent peppermint. "I spent years thinking you were my enemy because it was easy," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intense register. "It was easy to hate a symbol. It's much harder to ignore a person." "You don't have to ignore me," she whispered. "Don't I? Look at us, Granger. You're the golden girl. I'm the boy who had to be forced by a curse to show you I had a soul. If I walk into the library and sit next to you, the whole school will talk. If I touch you—" He paused, his gaze dropping to her hand. "If I touch you, I'm the Death Eater who's tainting the war hero." The seesaw swung back toward the warmth, but it was a desperate, scorched earth kind of warmth. "Let them talk," Hermione said, her voice trembling with a sudden, fierce defiance. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his. Draco stiffened, his breath hitching. Without the bond, the contact was different. It was more intentional, more weighted with choice. He looked down at their joined hands, his expression one of utter disbelief. "They'll hate you for this," he warned. "They already hate me for being different. They hate me for being too much. I'm tired of caring about what people who weren't there think about the war." She stepped into his space, her forehead nearly touching his. "I know who you are, Draco. I don't need a magical bridge to tell me anymore." The tension broke. Draco groaned, a low sound of surrender, and pulled her into the shadow of the pillar. His arms wrapped around her waist, crushing her against him. It wasn't the tentative, fragile embrace from the North Gallery. It was a claim. "You're going to be the death of me, Granger," he whispered into her hair. "Good. Then we'll be ghosts together." They stood there for a long time, the mist swallowing the courtyard. The internal conflict, the fear of judgment, the weight of the past, was still there, but it was being pushed back by the sheer force of their connection. This was the slow burn reaching its ignition point. But as the sun began to set, casting long, bruised shadows across the stone, the cold returned in the form of a realization. The 8th part of their story was coming, the final resolution. They couldn't stay in the shadows of the courtyard forever. "Potter is looking for you," Draco said, his voice returning to its restrained aristocratic tone, though he didn't let go of her hand. "I can feel it, not through the bond, but because he's been glaring at the back of my head all day." "Let him look," Hermione said, though she felt a twinge of guilt. "No, we do this right, or we don't do it at all." He pulled back, his eyes searching hers. The grey was no longer stormy. It was clear and determined. "Meet me at the lake tonight, after the feast. No potions, no artifacts, just us." "The lake? It's where things end, isn't it? The ship leaves, the water settles." He leaned down and pressed a lingering kiss to her forehead. It was a gesture of such tenderness, it made Hermione's throat tighten. "Don't be late, Hermione." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the mist with a fluid, haunting grace. Hermione stayed in the courtyard until the chill of the evening seeped into her bones. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, but for the first time in weeks, they were orderly. She knew what she wanted. She knew what she had to do. The enemy in my head was gone, but the man he had left behind was the only person she wanted to see at the end of the world. She walked back toward the castle, her heart beating a steady, rhythmic pulse. As she entered the great hall for the feast, she saw Harry and Ron watching her. She saw the suspicious glances from the Slytherins. She saw the world as it was, fractured and judgmental. But then she looked at the high table where the candlelight reflected in the windows, and she thought of the dark, still water of the lake. The final shift was coming. The seesaw was about to settle into its final position. And as she sat down to eat, Hermione felt a strange, calm certainty. The silence wasn't a void after all. It was a space they could finally fill with their own words. The black lake was a mirror of ink, reflecting a sky so heavy with stars, it felt as though the world had been turned upside down. The air was biting, a harbinger of the winter that would soon lock the highlands in ice, but Hermione did not shiver. She stood on the pebbled shore, the water lapping at the toes of her boots with a rhythmic, hypnotic sigh. The silence here was different from the silence in her head. It wasn't empty. It was expectant. She heard him before she saw him. The crunch of gravel beneath dragon-hide boots was a sound she had learned to distinguish from all others. Draco emerged from the darkness of the tree line, his silver-blonde hair appearing almost incandescent in the moonlight. He had discarded his school robes, wearing only a dark, high-collared coat that made him look like a figure from an old, tragic painting. He stopped a few feet away from her. Without the bond, The space between them felt vast, yet charged with a magnetic pull that made her fingertips ache. "You came," he said. His voice was steady, but beneath the surface, Hermione caught the familiar tremor of the man who had once begged for silence. "I said I would." Draco walked to the water's edge, standing beside her. He looked out at the horizon, where the mountains met the sky in a jagged line of shadow. "I spent most of my life hating this lake," he murmured. "It's cold, it's deep, and it hides things that shouldn't exist. My father told me it was a reminder that even in a place of learning, there are depths a wizard should never touch." "And now?" Hermione asked, turning to look at his profile. "Now I think he was just afraid of things he couldn't control." Draco turned to her, his expression softening into something so vulnerable it was almost painful to witness. "The way I was afraid of you." The seesaw of their past, the years of vitriol, the weeks of shared psychic agony, the moments of desperate warmth, seemed to converge here on this narrow strip of shore. The external plot of the war and the artifact had fallen away, leaving only the raw emotional dynamic that had survived the wreckage. "Are you still afraid?" she asked, stepping closer. Draco reached out, his hand hovering in the air between them before finally settling on her shoulder. His grip was firm, grounding. "Terrified," he admitted, "but not of you. I'm afraid of the version of myself I see when I'm with you, the one who thinks he might be worth something." "You are worth everything," Hermione whispered. She reached up, covering his hand with hers. "I didn't need a soul tether to see that, Draco. I saw it the moment you refused to identify Harry at the manor. I saw it in the library when you handed me that quill before I even knew I needed it. You were always there, hiding behind your pride." Draco let out a jagged breath, his forehead dropping to rest against hers. "I don't know how to do this, Hermione. I don't know how to be the person you deserve. The world is going to tell you every day that you made a mistake. My own mother will probably think I've lost my mind." "Then we'll be mad together," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "I've spent my whole life doing what was expected, being the brightest witch, the golden girl, the voice of reason. For once, I want to choose something just because it's mine, even if it's difficult, even if it's you." The non-verbal intimacy of the moment was overwhelming. In the silence, their breathing began to sink, a slow, deep rhythm that mirrored the movement of the lake. Draco moved his hand from her shoulder to her waist, pulling her flush against him. The slow burn of their 8th year had finally reached its destination. "I love the way you think," he whispered into the space between their lips. "I love the way your mind never rests, how you fight for things no one else cares about. I used to call it annoying because I was jealous of your fire. Now, I just want to stay warm by it." "Then stay," she commanded softly. Draco leaned down, and this time the kiss was not a desperate attempt to bridge a magical gap or a frantic reaction to a shared memory. It was slow, deliberate, and full of a quiet, soul-deep certainty. It tasted of the cold night air and the lingering sweetness of the feast, but more than that, it tasted of forgiveness. It was the final shift of the seesaw, the moment where the enemy was buried forever under the still waters of the lake. Hermione pulled him closer, her hands sliding up his chest to wrap around his neck. She felt the steady, strong thrum of his heart against her own. There was no magical voice telling her how he felt, but she didn't need one. She could feel the way his body relaxed into hers, the way his fingers tangled in her hair with a possessive, reverent touch. When they finally broke apart, they didn't move away. They stayed in the circle of each other's arms, watching the moon begin its slow descent toward the mountains. "What happens tomorrow?" Hermione asked. Draco looked toward the castle, the windows of the great hall glowing like embers in the distance. "Tomorrow, I'll walk you to the library. I'll sit at your table. I'll probably endure a dozen hexes from Weasley and a lecture from Potter." He looked back at her, a smirk playing on his lips. The old, arrogant Draco, but tempered with a new, genuine light. "And then, I'll ask you to help me with my ancient runes translation, because I know you can't resist correcting my grammar." Hermione laughed, a bright, clear sound that seemed to chase away the last of the shadows. "You're insufferable." "And you're a know-it-all," he countered, leaning down to press a soft, lingering kiss to the tip of her nose. "But you're my know-it-all." The internal conflict that had defined their lives for 7 years had finally found its resolution. The broken prejudices, the doubts, and the fears hadn't vanished. They were still there, like the stones at the bottom of the lake. But the water above them was clear. As they began the walk back toward the castle, hand in hand, the silence was no longer a void. It was a canvas. They passed the gates, the stone gargoyles watching them with sightless eyes. The air was still cold, the night still long, but as Draco squeezed her hand and pulled her closer for one last kiss under the shadow of the entrance hall, Hermione knew that the enemy was gone. In his place stood a man who had been broken and mended, a man who had seen the darkness and chosen the light. And as they stepped into the warmth of the castle together, Hermione Granger realized that she didn't need to be in his head to know exactly what he was thinking. He was thinking of her, and she, finally, was only thinking of him. The journey from "can't stand it" to "can't help but think" was complete. The tether was broken, but the connection was permanent. Under the flickering candlelight of the hallway, they shared one last look, a look of mutual understanding, of shared scars, and of a future that, for the first time, belonged entirely to them. The end of the war had been a relief, but the beginning of this, of them, was a triumph. "Ready?" Draco asked, his hand on the heavy oak door. "Ready," Hermione replied. They stepped through the door and into the light together. The morning after the lake was a cold, clinical reality. The silver mist of the highlands had crept into the very stones of the castle, turning the corridors into long, hollow tunnels of grey. Hermione sat at the Gryffindor table, her hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee. For the first time in weeks, her mind was her own. There was no static, no echo, no phantom scent of peppermint. It was the privacy she had prayed for, yet it felt like a limb had been amputated. She found herself constantly glancing at the entrance of the great hall, her heart skipping a beat every time the heavy oak doors creaked open. When Draco finally walked in, the hall didn't just grow quiet, it chilled. He didn't look like the broken boy from the astronomy tower or the desperate man from the room of requirement. He moved with the practiced grace of a Malfoy, his chin tilted high, his expression a mask of pale marble. But he wasn't heading for the Slytherin table. He walked straight toward the red and gold. Hermione felt the collective gasp of the student body like a physical wave. Beside her, Ron froze with a piece of toast halfway to his mouth. Harry pushed his glasses up his nose, his hand instinctively twitching toward his wand. Draco stopped directly behind Hermione. "Is this seat taken, Granger?" he asked. His voice was calm, but Hermione could see the slight tension in his jaw. "Malfoy, what the hell are you doing?" Ron hissed, finally finding his voice. "Get back to the snake pit." Draco didn't even look at him. His grey eyes remained fixed on the back of Hermione's head. Hermione took a slow, steadying breath and slid over on the bench, making a space that felt like a canyon. "Sit down, Draco," she said. The silence that followed was absolute. Draco sat. He didn't reach for the food. He simply sat there, his shoulder inches from hers. The non-verbal intimacy of the gesture was louder than any shout. He was publicly choosing a side, burning the bridges of his lineage in front of the entire wizarding world. "Hermione, you can't be serious," Harry whispered, his eyes darting between them. "After everything, after the war, you're letting him sit here." "I'm letting a classmate sit where he chooses, Harry," she replied, her voice trembling slightly but holding firm. "The war is over. If we don't start acting like it, then what was the point of any of it?" Through the absence of the bond, Hermione realized she was learning a new language, the language of observation. She didn't need to feel Draco's pulse to know he was terrified. She saw it in the way his fingers curled into his palms, the way he refused to blink. She reached under the table, her hand searching for his. When she found it, his fingers clamped around hers with a desperate, crushing strength. He wasn't okay. He was falling apart, but he was doing it beside her. The breakfast was a miserable affair of whispers and pointed glares. Every clink of a spoon felt like a judgment. When the bells finally rang for the first period, the tension snapped. Draco stood up, pulling Hermione with him. "I have ancient runes," he muttered, his voice low and private. "So do I," she said. They walked out of the great hall together, a silver and gold blur against the sea of black robes. As they reached the first-floor corridor, Draco pulled her into a recessed alcove behind a suit of armor. He slammed his hand against the stone wall, leaning his forehead against it. "That was the hardest thing I've ever done," he breathed. "Harder than the cabinet, harder than the tower." "I know," Hermione said, stepping into his space. She didn't have the magical bridge anymore, but she had something better, the truth. "You survived it, Draco. You're still standing." "They hate me," he said, finally looking at her. The mask was gone now, replaced by a raw, jagged exhaustion. "Your friends, my house, they look at me like I'm a disease you've caught." "Let them look. We aren't them. We aren't the names they call us." She reached up, cupping his face. His skin was cold from the morning air. "The silence is hard, isn't it?" "It's deafening," he admitted. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. "I keep reaching for you in my head and finding nothing. It makes me feel like I'm disappearing." "You aren't disappearing. You're just finally yours again, and I'm finally mine." She stood on her tiptoes, pressing her forehead against his. "We have to learn how to do this the human way, Draco. No shortcuts, no shared thoughts, just words." "I'm not good with words," he whispered. "Then use the silence, but use it with me." The bell rang again, signaling the start of lessons. but neither moved. The seesaw was no longer about repulsion. It was about the struggle to stay balanced in a world that wanted to push them over. By the afternoon, the rumours had mutated. Some said Hermione had used a confundus charm on Malfoy. Others said Draco had used a love potion on the Golden Girl. The tension in the library was suffocating. Hermione tried to focus on her translation of the Elder Futhark, but the weight of the stairs was a physical pressure on her back. Draco sat across from her, his head buried in a thick volume on alchemical theory. He hadn't spoken for an hour. The non-verbal atmosphere between them was thick with unsaid things. Every time their eyes met over the tops of their books, a flash of heat would ignite in Hermione's chest, a phantom echo of the bond that refused to die. "They're waiting for us to fail," Draco said suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet of the library like a blade. Hermione looked up. "Who?" "Everyone. Potter, Weasley, my mother. They're all just waiting for the moment I snap, or you realise I'm not worth the trouble." He closed his book with a soft thud. "Maybe they're right, Hermione. Look at me. I don't know how to be good. I only know how to be quiet. Being quiet isn't a sin, Draco, and good isn't a destination. It's a choice you make every morning when you wake up." She reached across the table, her fingers grazing his. "You think I'm perfect? I'm terrified every single day that I'm not doing enough, that I'm losing the people I love because I can't stop fighting for things they don't understand." "You're fighting for me," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm fighting for us." The seesaw tipped toward the warmth, but it was a fragile, flickering thing. Draco looked at her hand on his expression softening into a look of such profound longing it made her breath hitch. "I went to the owlery this morning," he confessed. "I wrote to my mother. I told her I wasn't coming back to the manor for the Christmas break. I told her I was staying here, with you." Hermione felt a lump form in her throat. The manor was the only home he had ever known, no matter how haunted it was. To give that up was to give up his last tether to his old life. "Draco, you didn't have to." "I did." He stood up, gathering his things. "If I'm going to have an enemy in my head, I want it to be my own conscience, not my father's ghost. And if I'm going to be with you, I can't have one foot in that house." He walked toward the exit, but stopped at the end of the table. He leaned down, his lips brushing against her ear. "The silence is better when I know you're the reason for it," he whispered. He left before she could respond, leaving the scent of peppermint and cold rain in his wake. Hermione sat in the library, the brightest witch of her age, reduced to a trembling mess by a single sentence. The external plot of their lives was closing in, the judgment of their peers, the disappointment of their families. But the internal development was reaching a point of no return. They were no longer two souls forced together by a broken artifact. They were two people choosing to stay together in the ruins. As the sun set, casting long orange shadows across the parchment, Hermione realized that the enemy in my head hadn't been Draco Malfoy at all. The enemy was the fear that she couldn't be loved for who she really was, and the fear that he couldn't be forgiven for what he had been. But as she packed her bags, she felt a strange, quiet peace. The silence wasn't a cage anymore. It was an invitation. She walked out into the corridor, looking for the boy with the silver hair and the jagged heart. She knew he was waiting for her. Not because she could feel his thoughts, but because she knew his soul. The ninth part of their story ended not with a kiss, but with a step forward, into the light, together. The atmosphere in Hogwarts had shifted from a Cold War to a pressurized chamber. Christmas was approaching, and the castle was being decorated with enchanted snow and floating candles. But for Draco and Hermione, the festive cheer felt like a mockery. The silence in Hermione's head, once a source of grief, had become a space where she had to learn to trust her own eyes again. Without the magical tether, every look from Draco was a mystery she had to solve, and every touch was a question she had to answer. The conflict of the 10th chapter was not one of magic, but of loyalty. It arrived in the form of a silver-grey owl, bearing the Malfoy seal, which dropped a heavy parchment onto the table during breakfast. Draco didn't open it at the table. He didn't have to. The very sight of the wax seal caused a ripple of whispers to erupt around them. Hermione felt the tension radiating off him, not as a psychic wave, but as a physical vibration. His shoulders were locked, his jaw so tight it looked as though the bone might snap. "Don't," Hermione whispered, her hand finding his under the table. "Not here." He nodded once, his eyes dark and hollow. They left the great hall under the weight of 100 gazes. They didn't go to the library or the common rooms. They headed for the one place that had become their sanctuary, the old abandoned potions classroom in the dungeons. Once the door clicked shut, the silence of the room rushed in to meet them. Draco threw the letter onto a dusty workbench, as if it were poisoned. "It's from my mother," he said, his voice a jagged rasp. "She doesn't understand. She thinks I'm being coerced. She thinks the mudblood has used some dark Potterborn hex to turn me against my blood." Hermione winced at the slur, even though she knew he was quoting Narcissa. The words still had teeth. It still carried the weight of the cellar floor. "And what does she want you to do, Draco?" "She wants me to come home. She says the Ministry is looking for reasons to revoke our probation. She says my association with you is being seen as a calculated move to garner sympathy, and it's insulting the dignity of the Malfoy name." He let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "Dignity, as if we have any left." He turned to her, and the seesaw swung violently toward despair. The warmth of their shared breakfast was gone, replaced by the cold, biting reality of their status. "Maybe she's right, Hermione," he said, his eyes searching hers with a desperate intensity. "Not about the hex, but about the cost. Look what I'm doing to you. Harry and Ron won't even look at you in the common room. The Slytherins treat me like a traitor. You're losing your world because of a boy who can't even look at his own reflection without flinching." "I am not losing anything, Draco," she said, stepping toward him. "I am choosing. There is a difference." "You shouldn't have to choose," he roared, slamming his hand against the stone wall. The sound echoed like a gunshot. "You should be the hero. You should be at the Ministry, changing the world, not hiding in a basement with a pariah." The internal conflict was reaching a breaking point. Draco's guilt was a living thing, a shadow that sat on his chest and told him he was a burden. He was trying to push her away, not because he hated her, but because he loved her enough to think she deserved better than him. "Stop it," she commanded, her voice low and dangerous. She walked right into his personal space, forcing him to look at her. Stop deciding what I deserve. I spent 17 years being told who I should be. I'm done with it." She reached up, grabbing the lapels of his coat and pulling him down so they were eye to eye. "I saw your soul, Draco. I felt your heartbeat in my own chest. I know the man who wanted to save Dumbledore. I know the man who held me while I cried. That man is worth every glare, every whisper, and every lost friend." The non-verbal intimacy of the moment was suffocating. Draco's breathing hitched. He looked at her, really looked at her, and the anger in his eyes dissolved into a raw, bleeding vulnerability. He reached out, his hands trembling as they cupped her face. His thumbs traced the line of her cheekbones, a touch so reverent it felt like a prayer. "Why are you so stubborn?" he whispered. "Because I'm a Gryffindor. It's what we do." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. The seesaw tipped back toward the warmth. In the dim, greenish light of the dungeons, they were the only two people in the world. The silence was no longer an enemy. It was a blanket. "I'm not going back," he said, the resolve hardening in his voice. "I'll stay for the holidays. If the Ministry wants to come for me, let them. I'd rather be in Azkaban with a clear head than in that house with my mother's lies." "You won't go to Azkaban," Hermione promised. "I won't let them." She reached down, picking up the letter from the workbench. With a flick of her wand, she ignited the corner. They watched together as the parchment curled and blackened, the elegant, cold script of Narcissa Malfoy disappearing into ash. As the last spark died out, Draco pulled her into his arms. This wasn't the desperate, frantic embrace of their first kiss. This was a slow, grounding surrender. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his breath warm against her skin. Hermione held him, her fingers tangling in the soft silver hair at the nape of his neck. Through the absence of the magic, she felt something stronger, a choice. Every second he stayed in her arms was a second he was choosing her over his past, his family, and his pride. "I have to tell Harry and Ron," she murmured against his shoulder. "The whole truth, not just about the artifact, but about this." Draco stiffened for a moment, then relaxed. "They'll hate me even more." "Perhaps. No, they'll know I'm not being forced. They'll know I'm happy." Happy. The word felt strange in her mouth, yet it was the only one that fit. Despite the war, despite the whispers, despite the enemy in her head being replaced by a complicated, brooding boy, she was happy. They stayed there for a long time. The only sound, the distant drip of water and the rhythmic thrum of two hearts that no longer needed a spell to beat in time. The tension of the outside world was still there, waiting for them behind the heavy oak door. But for now, the seesaw was balanced. Draco pulled back just enough to look at her. His eyes were no longer winter cold. They were the colour of the sea after a storm, clear and deep. He leaned down and kissed her, a soft, lingering touch that tasted of salt and smoke. "Merry Christmas, Hermione," he whispered. "Merry Christmas, Draco." As they walked out of the classroom, hand in hand, the shadows of the dungeons seemed less frightening. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were two people building a bridge out of the ruins of their own lives. The 10th part of their story ended with a scent of burnt parchment and a feeling of absolute, terrifying freedom. The enemy was truly dead, and in the silence that followed, they were finally learning how to speak. The final day of the spring term arrived with the sun so bright it felt like a provocation. The great hall was filled with the frantic energy of students preparing to leave, the air thick with the scent of travel trunks, owls, and the bitter-sweet tang of endings. But for Hermione, the noise was merely a backdrop to the terrifying, beautiful clarity of her own heart. The enemy in my head had long since been silenced, replaced by a man who stood beside her now, not because of a curse, but because he had nowhere else he'd rather be. The conflict of this final chapter was the most daunting of all. The transition from the safety of the castle to the unforgiving reality of the world outside. Hermione stood on the platform of Hogsmeade Station, the Hogwarts Express hissing steam like a great iron beast. To her left stood Harry and Ron. The tension between them and Draco had not vanished, but it had settled into a wary, respectful distance. They had seen Hermione's unwavering resolve. They had seen the way Draco shielded her from the vitriol of the remaining Slytherin hardliners. They didn't understand it, and perhaps they never fully would, but they loved her enough to let her choose. "You're sure about this, Hermione?" Ron asked, his eyes darting to Draco, who was standing a few paces away, guarding their luggage. "My mum. She said there's always a bed at the Burrow. You don't have to go to London alone." "I'm not going alone, Ron," Hermione said softly, reaching out to squeeze his arm. "And I'm not going to be alone in London either. My parents are still getting settled back in their house. I need to be there. And Draco. He needs a place where he isn't a ghost." Harry looked at Draco, then back at Hermione. His expression was solemn. "Just be careful. The Prophet is still looking for a scandal. And Malfoy. If you hurt her, I don't care about the probation. I'll find you." It was the closest thing to a blessing Draco was likely to get. As the train whistle blew, Hermione turned toward Draco. He looked striking in the sunlight, his pale skin finally losing its grey, sickly hue, his eyes reflecting the blue of the sky. He was no longer the boy who hid in the shadows of the library. He was a man who had burned his inheritance for a chance at a soul. "Ready to leave the cage?" he asked as she approached. "It wasn't a cage, Draco. It was a cocoon," she replied, interlacing her fingers with his. The train ride was a blur of green hills and shifting light. They sat in a small compartment, the door locked against prying eyes. For the first time, there was no need for books or research. They simply sat in the silence they had fought so hard to reclaim. "I've realized something," Draco said, breaking the quiet as the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the velvet seats. "What's that?" "The artifact, the speculum mentis. It didn't create anything." He looked at her, his gaze intense and unwavering. "It just stripped away the lies. I think I was always looking for you, Hermione, even when I was calling you names, even when I was trying to be my father's son. I was just too loud in my own head to hear it." The seesaw gave one final gentle tilt toward the warmth. The repulsion was gone. The betrayal was forgiven. The cold had been conquered. "I think I was looking for you too," she admitted. "I was looking for someone who could see me. Not the war hero, not the genius, but me. Even the parts of me that are messy and angry." As the train pulled into King's Cross, the atmosphere changed. This was the threshold. Outside those doors lay a world that remembered the war, a world that remembered the mark on Draco's arm and the blood on the floor of his home. They stepped off the train and onto the bustling platform. The air was thick with the smell of coal smoke and the mundane, comforting noise of the Muggle world leaking in from the other side of the barrier. "Where to now, Granger?" Draco asked. He sounded nervous, his grip on her hand tightening as a group of ministry officials walked past, casting suspicious glances at his silver hair. "My world," she said firmly. "A world where you aren't a Malfoy and I'm not a war hero. Just Draco and Hermione." They walked toward the barrier between Platform 9 and 3/4 and the Muggle station. They stopped just before the bricks. Draco looked at her, his expression a mix of terror and adoration. "I don't have anything to give you," he whispered. "No name, no fortune, no magic that isn't stained." "You're giving me the truth," she said, stepping into his space. "That's more than anyone else ever has." She reached up, her hands sliding behind his neck, pulling him down for the final kiss of their story. This wasn't a kiss of desperation or a kiss of discovery. It was a kiss of arrival. It was slow, deep, and tasted of the future. Through the non-verbal intimacy of the touch, Hermione felt everything she had once felt through the bond. His love, his fear, his hope. But this time, she knew it was real because he was choosing to show it to her. When they pulled apart, they were both breathless. The noise of the station rushed back in, but it didn't matter. The enemy in my head was gone, and the man standing before her was the only one she wanted to hear for the rest of her life. "Let's go," Draco said, his voice finally finding its strength. They stepped through the barrier together. The Muggle side of King's Cross was a chaotic symphony of commuters, tourists, and flickering arrival boards. No one looked at Draco's robes. No one stared at the scar on Hermione's arm. They were just two young people in love, lost in the crowd of a city that was too busy to care about their past. They walked out onto the streets of London. The evening air was cool, and the city lights were beginning to twinkle like fallen stars. Draco looked up at the towering glass buildings, his eyes wide with a sense of wonder he hadn't felt since he was a child. "It's so big," he murmured. "It's a big world, Draco. Plenty of room for us to disappear." They started walking, their shoulders brushing, their hands joined in the dark. The internal conflicts that had defined their 8th year, the broken prejudices, the weight of the war, the fear of the silence, had all led to this moment of absolute, terrifying freedom. The story ended as it had begun, with two people who shouldn't have been together, forced to see the truth. But this time, there was no magic required to bridge the gap. As they turned the corner and disappeared into the glowing heart of the city, Hermione realized that the silence wasn't a void after all. It was a conversation that was only just beginning. The enemy was gone. The lover had arrived. And for the first time in her life, the world in her head was perfectly, beautifully quiet.
Thank you for staying with me until the very end. This story, The Enemy in My Head, is about more than just magic. It is about the walls we build around our hearts. Draco and Hermione were born to hate each other. Their war made them enemies, but pain made them human. I believe that true love starts with understanding. Sometimes we need to see the world through someone else's eyes. We need to feel their fears, to forgive their mistakes. In this story, the magic forced them to be close, but in the end, They choose each other without any spells. They choose to be kind. They choose to be brave. I hope this story reminded you of one thing. Even in the darkest time, we can find light in another person. Even the deepest scars can heal. Thank you for listening. Keep believing in magic and keep believing in love.